They watched her fall, but no one moved. Rain poured across her shoulders, soaking the thin blanket wrapped around a crying baby. She was invisible until a stranger stepped out of a luxury car, and everything changed. Lucia Reyes could barely feel her legs anymore. The rain pounded over the cracked sidewalk like 1,000 drumming fists, soaking through her thrift store sneakers, making her shiver until her teeth rattled. Her hands trembled as she clutched baby Mateo to her chest, his tiny body burning with fever. She had been carrying him for what felt like a lifetime, her back screaming, her knees ready to give out. And then, they did. Lucia fell forward onto her knees, the wet concrete biting into her skin. A sharp pain shot up her spine, but she tightened her arms around Mateo, shielding him with her own body. He whimpered, weak and confused, and his soft cry cut through the air like a blade. People passed by. Some slowed, their umbrellas hovering for a second as they looked at the young woman on the ground, soaked, cradling a sick baby. Then they kept walking. A few turned away, as if afraid kindness might cost them something. The rain hid Lucia's tears, but her heart felt as raw and exposed as her skin. For a moment, she could not breathe. A hot, shameful thought flashed through her mind: they see a dirty immigrant. They see a burden. That's all. Lucia had felt this cold rejection before, at the grocery store when someone looked away after seeing her food stamps, at the hospital where a security guard demanded to see her identification before letting her into the waiting room, even at church where she'd once hoped to find comfort but instead found suspicious stares. Being a Latina, alone, undocumented, and poor, she had learned that those identities were enough to make people look right through her. To them, she was not a mother trying to protect her child. She was an inconvenience. A question mark. Someone better ignored. The pain of that knowledge ran deeper than any bruise. It was a wound reopened every day. Lucia had done everything she could to survive. She'd washed dishes until her hands cracked, cleaned strangers' houses until her knuckles bled, slept on shelter cots beside strangers who coughed and cursed through the night. Every moment was a fight to keep Mateo safe. Yet tonight, it felt like the world had already decided she did not belong here. No one would help. No one even saw her as human. Lucia's arms quivered as she tried to stand again, but her strength gave out. Mateo let out a small cry, high and weak, and she looked down at him, tears sliding down her cheeks. His lips looked dry. His cheeks burned with fever. The last clinic had turned her away because she could not show insurance. The shelter was full. There was nowhere to go, and her son needed help. She held him tighter, fighting a rising panic that threatened to choke her. God, please, she prayed, voice shaking in her mind, just help him. Help me. She heard footsteps splashing through a puddle, coming closer. Hope flared inside her, but then faded when the footsteps moved past without stopping. The voice of the world was loud in her head, get up. Move on. Nobody is coming. But then a strange hush fell. A motor hummed low, a car door opened, and a different set of footsteps approached. They were steady, deliberate, cutting through the cold rain. Lucia braced herself, expecting another warning to move, another harsh look, another reminder that she was not welcome on these streets. Instead, a calm voice broke through the storm. Are you all right? Lucia looked up. Through the rain, she saw a tall man with dark hair, dressed in a crisp coat, his eyes warm but searching. Behind him stood a sleek black car, its headlights gleaming against the rain. He looked like he'd stepped out of another world entirely, a world of safety, of power, of possibilities she could not imagine. She froze, fear clawing at her. What if he was from the authorities? What if he called social services? They would take Mateo. They would destroy what little she had left. He must have seen her panic, because he crouched down to her level, hands open and empty. I'm not here to hurt you, he said, voice gentle. Can you stand? Lucia clutched Mateo tighter, her shoulders hunching. Her heart pounded in her throat. Everything in her body screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The man's eyes met hers, steady and calm, and for a moment she saw something there, something she had nearly forgotten existed. Compassion. "I can help," he continued, still quiet, still gentle. "You don't have to be alone right now." Lucia shook her head, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "No, no, they'll take him. They'll take my baby." The man paused, understanding flashing across his face. "No one is taking him," he promised softly. "Not while I'm here. I swear." Lucia could hardly believe it. The rain fell harder, soaking her thin coat until it clung like a second skin, but the man didn't flinch. He stayed right there, next to her in the cold, willing to listen. Willing to see her. That small act broke something inside her, a wall she'd held up for too long. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as she let the man take Matteo from her arms, just for a moment, so she could push herself to her feet. She had never let a stranger touch her baby, but right now, she had no choice. And somehow, it felt okay. The man's hands were steady, cradling Matteo gently against his chest, and Lucia watched through a blur of tears as he carefully covered the baby's head with his own scarf. Matteo let out a soft whimper, then relaxed, his small face turning into the warmth. "Let's get you both somewhere safe," the man said. "My name is David. You don't have to trust me yet. But let me try to help." Lucia nodded, unable to form words. David guided her toward the car, helping her into the passenger seat while he placed Matteo carefully in the back, checking twice that the seat was dry and warm. As Lucia settled against the padded leather, a wave of exhaustion nearly crushed her. The car smelled of clean soap and expensive upholstery, a world away from the moldy shelter where she had been staying. For a moment, she felt dizzy, disoriented, as if this was a cruel dream. But then David climbed in beside her, turning on the heater. Warm air blasted into the cold space, making Lucia's arms tingle painfully as her frozen skin thawed. Matteo stirred, eyes fluttering, and she reached back to touch him, to reassure herself he was still there. David glanced at her gently. "Do you need a hospital?" Lucia hesitated, panic catching in her throat again. A hospital meant questions. Papers. Proof. She shook her head quickly. "No, no hospital." He nodded, accepting her answer without argument. "Okay," he said softly. "Then let's go somewhere warm. Somewhere you can rest." Lucia tried to speak, to thank him, but her voice cracked under the weight of everything she had carried for too long. Instead, she bowed her head, tears flowing freely now, hidden by the sound of the rain drumming on the car roof. David pulled back onto the road, driving carefully through the flooded streets. The city outside was dark and uncaring, its sidewalks still full of people who had turned away from her, from a mother who had done nothing wrong but exist in the wrong skin, the wrong language, the wrong papers. Lucia had known, her whole life, that some people would never look beyond those things. But tonight, one man did. As the car turned onto a quieter road, past shuttered storefronts and flickering neon signs, Lucia looked out the window. Raindrops caught the light like broken stars. Somewhere deep inside her, a tiny spark of hope lit up, a hope she thought she'd lost forever. Matteo shifted in the back seat, letting out a soft sigh, and Lucia reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm still here," she reminded herself. "We're still here." And maybe, just maybe, someone finally saw them. She wanted to believe she was safe now, but the world had taught her better. When you've been ignored long enough, even kindness feels dangerous. The car's warmth pressed against Lucia's frozen limbs, seeping into her skin and making her shiver from the shock of it. Matteo let out a soft, raspy breath, and she reached over to stroke his cheek, checking for fever. The baby's skin was still warm, but at least he was no longer exposed to the cold. Relief tangled with fear in her chest, each battling for control of her heart. David kept his eyes on the road as they wound through city blocks she barely recognized. Lucia tried to track the turns, afraid of where he might take them, but fatigue pulled at her, making her head droop. When the car finally stopped, she looked up with a flash of panic. A small, well-lit house stood beyond a short iron gate. The porch glowed with a welcoming lamp, its light reflected in puddles that still shimmered from the rain. "Come inside," David said gently. He carried Matteo with a practiced steadiness that made Lucia wonder about his past. He moved like someone who'd learned to cradle fragile things. Lucia's feet felt like iron as she stepped out. Shame prickled under her skin, shame for being so weak, for needing this stranger's help, for falling apart in front of everyone. The hurt of society's coldness weighed on her heavier than any rain-soaked coat. She was a woman who had always been judged before being known, seen as disposable, unworthy. That wound never closed, no matter how much she tried to prove her worth. Inside the house, warmth greeted them in layers, soft heat from floor vents, the scent of clean wood, faint cinnamon from somewhere deeper in the home. Lucia hesitated at the door, afraid to dirty the polished floors with her wet shoes. David noticed, pausing to nod reassuringly. "It's all right," he said. "Come on." She stepped in, shrinking under the glow of the lights. Matteo began to cry, a thin, hoarse sound that broke her heart. David quickly guided them to a small guest room, where a simple crib had already been set up. Lucia's chest tightened with emotion. He must have prepared it quickly while she sat stunned in the car. She watched as David gently placed Matteo into the crib, carefully pulling a warm blanket around the baby's tiny shoulders. Matteo whimpered once, then quieted, soothed by the steady heat and safety of four walls. Lucia moved closer, placing a trembling hand on his forehead. The fever was still there, but maybe it was easing. David spoke in a calm voice, breaking her daze. "There's a doctor who can come here. Someone I trust. No questions, no papers. Would that help?" Lucia looked at him, tears threatening again. She had lived in fear of those questions her entire adult life. Every time someone asked, "Where are your documents?" Or "Who signed for you?" It felt like knives carving out her dignity. Even after so many years, it burned. The stares. The subtle scorn. The knowledge that her accent, her name, her face marked her as other. As lesser. She swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes," she whispered. "That would help." "Good," David replied. "He's a good pediatrician. He helped a friend of mine once." Lucia sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. The storm outside was finally dying, but inside, her mind still spun like a hurricane. Why did he care? Why would a man who had everything take the time to help someone like her? The resentment she carried, so long, so heavy, made it hard to accept this moment. After a lifetime of being stepped over, mistrusted, dismissed, part of her wanted to push his kindness away before it could be taken from her. It wasn't just about her immigration status. It was about how the world had treated her since she was a little girl. Teachers who sighed at her Spanish, neighbors who locked their doors when she walked by, employers who gave her the worst jobs and then paid her less. She had learned to survive in a society that never expected her to rise. She had learned to carry resentment so deep, it almost felt like a second heartbeat. As she sat, she noticed David watching her carefully, as if measuring every movement. She straightened up, ashamed of how exposed she felt. "Why are you doing this?" she blurted out, surprising herself with the edge in her voice. "You don't know me." David nodded, calm, unoffended. "I don't," he agreed. "But I saw you. And sometimes that's enough." Lucia looked away, her throat tight. She wanted to believe him, but 100 bad memories screamed louder. Memories of being turned away, of being told to go home, of being told her child was a mistake, that she was a mistake. Resentment burned in her veins, sharp and familiar. Even kindness felt like a trick waiting to break her heart. David spoke again, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to trust me yet. But trust that I want you and your son to be safe. Those words were gentle, but they knocked something loose inside her. She realized how exhausted she truly was, how the weight of suspicion and bitterness had made her body heavier than she could bear. Tears slipped down her face, silent and hot, mixing with the rain still clinging to her skin. "Thank you," she managed to say. David gave a small, kind smile. "Let me get you something to eat," he said. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." She nodded, swallowing hard. He left the room, footsteps muffled on the soft carpet. Lucia turned back to Matteo, brushing her fingers along his tiny hand. She wanted to believe the world might be different now. That maybe there were people who would see them. Value them. Protect them. But part of her still felt the sting of being othered, of being judged, of being ignored. Part of her still wanted to hide, to protect herself from the next blow. She would have to learn, somehow, to let kindness reach her again. As she leaned back, exhausted, she heard David return with a plate of warm rice and beans, and a gentle voice that reminded her she was still human, still worthy. He placed it on the nightstand, stepping back to give her space. The food smelled like hope. Lucia picked up the fork, hands trembling, and took a small bite. Warmth spread through her, and for the first time in so long, she felt like maybe she could breathe. Matteo stirred in the crib, letting out a soft sigh, and Lucia turned to him, grateful he was safe. Her heart ached with the memory of every time the world had let them down, but tonight, just tonight, she would hold on to this moment of grace. David stood in the doorway, watching over them with a quiet protectiveness that Lucia could not name. It was unfamiliar, but it was good. And in that goodness, there was room for hope. One moment of safety can vanish in a heartbeat. Just when Lucia thought she could breathe, the world reminded her exactly where she stood. Lucia woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the muffled sounds of Matteo babbling softly in the crib. It felt unreal for a second, no shouting, no cold floors, no one telling her to move along. The sun cut through the guest room curtains in pale, hesitant stripes. She sat up, trying to gather herself, grateful but still afraid. David had given them a night of shelter, but how long could such kindness last? She slipped quietly from the bed, checked on Matteo, then stepped into the hallway. The house was warm, impossibly quiet. Somewhere down the hall, David spoke on the phone, his voice serious but steady. Lucia paused, hearing words that made her skin prickle: social worker, undocumented, custody laws. Her heart clenched. Are they going to take Matteo? The terror nearly buckled her knees. In an instant, every ounce of resentment she'd ever carried about this country came flooding back, the way systems made people like her feel worthless, the way laws stacked against families instead of helping them. She knew too well how easy it was to lose a child just because you were poor or didn't have the right paperwork. Lucia stepped back into the room, her pulse pounding. She remembered that day at the clinic, when a nurse had quietly flagged her file after seeing no insurance, how a government caseworker later questioned her parenting. She'd never felt so exposed, so powerless. It was the same story at the food pantry, where volunteers measured her worth by the color of her skin and the accent in her voice. It all came back, 100 cuts that had never healed. She closed her eyes, breathing fast. Not again. I can't lose him. David appeared in the doorway, noticing her panic. Lucia, he said calmly, it's okay. The social worker is a friend. She helps keep families together. That's why I called her. Lucia tried to trust him, but her chest burned with suspicion. Too many broken promises, too many moments when help turned into betrayal. The government was supposed to protect families, yet in her world, it only took them apart. She had seen mothers lose children for missing a signature, or because an officer decided they were unfit without ever hearing their story. Are you sure? She whispered, tears brimming. They won't take him. David nodded firmly. I promise. She's different. Lucia bit her lip, torn between hope and fear. Resentment still smoldered like coals in her stomach. The American dream, for someone like her, had always been a lie told through smiling politicians. A dream with an asterisk, only for some. When the doorbell rang, Lucia startled, heart hammering. David went to answer it, letting in a woman with kind eyes and a badge clipped to her sweater. She spoke gently, introducing herself as Marisol, a family advocate rather than a state agent. Lucia still stepped protectively in front of Mateo, unable to shake the instinct to shield him. Marisol raised her hands. "I'm here to help you keep your baby," she said softly. "I'm not with Child Protective Services. I promise." Lucia looked at David, then back at Marisol, trying to read them both. Finally, she nodded, but the tension in her body didn't leave. As Marisol sat down with a battered folder full of forms and pamphlets, Lucia felt a wave of exhaustion. Even now, even with all these people trying to help, she was still under a microscope. Still measured. Still judged. Halfway through their talk, an unexpected knock came at the door, sharp, loud, official. David frowned and stepped into the foyer. Lucia's heart leapt into her throat. She scooped up Mateo, clutching him tight as voices carried from the hall. "Is there a Lucia Reyes here?" a male voice demanded. David's tone was polite but firm. "Who are you?" "County Health Inspector," the voice replied. "We received an anonymous tip about an unlicensed child being sheltered here." Lucia's blood ran cold. Anonymous tip. Someone had reported her. Maybe a neighbor, maybe even someone from the hospital. It didn't matter. They had found her. Panic exploded through her, memories flooding back of border checkpoints, of being told she had no rights, of cold stares when she tried to stand up for herself. This is how they break you, she thought. They make you feel you don't belong. David stepped between the men and Lucia. "You can't just walk in here," he insisted. "There's no emergency." The inspector's voice turned sharper. "Sir, we have the authority to check on the welfare of a minor. If you refuse, we'll get a warrant." Lucia held Mateo tighter, breath shallow. Her resentment boiled over, the memories of every official who had treated her like she was disposable. "You never looked at me," she wanted to scream. "You only saw a number, a file, a problem." David turned, meeting Lucia's eyes. "I won't let them take him," he promised quietly. "But you have to trust me." Lucia trembled, her arms aching. Mateo started to cry, and she rocked him gently, fighting for calm. Marisol put a steady hand on her shoulder. "Lucia, they legally can't remove him without cause. You have rights." Rights, Lucia thought bitterly. For people like me, they always come too late. But she nodded, trying to believe them. David spoke to the inspector firmly, showing them to the doorway. "There is no neglect here," he said. "And if you keep harassing this family, we will file a complaint." The inspector paused, clearly surprised by David's confidence, then backed down. "We'll be back if there are more reports," he warned. When the door finally closed, Lucia let out a sob she didn't know she'd been holding. Her knees shook. Marisol guided her to the couch, helping her sit, while David stood close, protective. The world had reminded her again, no matter how hard she tried, she was always one phone call away from losing everything. An emotional twist gripped her chest, overwhelming and sharp. She realized for the first time that she might not survive another blow like this. If they took Mateo, if the system turned on her again, she would not recover. David saw her crumble and knelt beside her. "I won't let them do that," he said again, voice steady, eyes fierce. "You're safe here." Lucia looked at him through tears, desperate to believe him, but the fear was too deep, the memories too fresh. Still, some fragile hope held her together, even as resentment and gratitude warred inside her. She rocked Mateo slowly, letting the moment of safety sink in, praying it might last, and bracing for the next storm. She thought she knew how much the world could take from her. But the next knock on the door proved there was still more to lose. The hours after the county inspector left were a blur. Lucia could barely eat, barely rest. Even when Mateo finally fell asleep against her shoulder, she felt like an alarm clock, wound tight, ready to explode. Every footstep outside the house set her nerves on fire. Every car door in the street made her jump. David tried to calm her, bringing warm tea, gentle words, promising over and over that she was safe. But Lucia's mind had been trained to expect betrayal. For too many years, she had watched this world pick apart people like her, people with accents, people with brown skin, people whose paperwork was never quite right. They were judged before they were known, punished before they were understood. When David asked if she wanted to tell her story, she hesitated. The words felt dangerous. They had always been dangerous. In her old neighborhood, the more you told, the more people could use against you. Lucia had learned to guard her truth like a secret map, but now, a small voice in her chest begged, maybe someone should finally know. She agreed to talk, if David would promise to listen, truly listen. And he did. He sat across from her on the floor while Mateo slept in the crib, and he didn't interrupt once. She told him how she left Honduras, carrying her child and a single backpack, crossing into a country that spoke of freedom but too often gave her only suspicion. She told him how a neighbor once called police just because she and Mateo laughed too loudly behind a thin apartment wall. How the food stamps that kept them alive also marked them as freeloaders in judgmental eyes. How a shelter worker lectured her about being irresponsible for having a baby, without papers, even as she changed Mateo's diaper under flickering fluorescent lights. Lucia's voice trembled, and David stayed quiet, letting every word land. The resentment in her words was sharp, almost metallic. The system was supposed to protect mothers and children, but instead it had given her 1,000 ways to fail. The dream of a better life had been buried under layers of bias and bureaucracy. She cried then, tears she thought had run out weeks ago. "I never wanted to take from anyone," she whispered. "I just wanted him to be safe." David nodded, eyes gentle. "You've done more for him than most could," he said. "You kept him alive. That matters." His words broke something open inside her. The constant pain of being labeled unworthy, the years of proving, always proving, it spilled out in a river of tears. David waited, steady as stone, never pulling away. For the first time in so long, Lucia felt seen, fully seen, without shame. They fell into a fragile quiet as night deepened. Lucia rocked Mateo gently in the dark, and David sat nearby, protecting that silence. But just when she felt calm settle over her like a thin blanket, a loud pounding came at the door. Not polite, not patient, demanding. Her breath caught, fear roaring through her. Again. She thought wildly. They won't stop until they break me. David stepped toward the door, but Lucia grabbed his arm. Don't, she gasped. Please. Don't let them take him. It's okay, he tried to reassure, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the worry in his eyes. They moved together to the entryway, hearts hammering in sync. On the other side stood a tall man in a suit, the rain dripping from his overcoat. He looked official, but also tired, not cruel, but not gentle either. "Ms. Reyes?" he asked, scanning the room behind David. "I'm with Family Court Services. I need to speak with you." Lucia felt like the floor tilted under her. Family Court. That was worse than a county inspector. That was someone who could take Mateo by legal force. David stiffened. "She's done nothing wrong," he argued. "There is no neglect here." The man sighed. "A report was made. I have to follow up. I'm sorry." Lucia clutched Mateo against her, hatred and fear tangling in her chest. "This country will never let me breathe," she thought. "They will chase me until I vanish." The resentment burned so strong it was hard to see through it, hard to even stand. But then Marisol stepped forward from behind them. The advocate had stayed after the inspector left, just in case. She showed her badge, voice strong. "Sir, there is no cause here. I will stand as witness, and if you proceed, we will file an emergency injunction." The court worker hesitated. Lucia watched him closely, still shaking. Was this really happening? Another attempt to rip her apart, in a single day? The court worker looked at Marisol's badge, then at Lucia, then at David, and finally exhaled. "I'll note it in the report," he said. "But I still have to document my visit." David nodded tightly. "You can observe, but nothing more." The man stepped inside, looking around. Mateo began to cry, sensing the tension. Lucia tried to calm him, whispering Spanish lullabies, praying her voice didn't crack. The official wrote notes, snapped photos of the crib, asked quiet questions that still felt like knives to Lucia's spirit. Each question echoed every failure society had tried to pin on her. Why didn't you have a better place? Why didn't you plan? Why didn't you stay silent and small? It felt endless. She wanted to scream, because I am human. But the fear choked her words. Finally the man left, promising to submit a neutral report, and David closed the door behind him with a shaky breath. Lucia collapsed to the floor, Mateo still in her arms, the terror leaving her body in harsh, ragged sobs. David knelt beside her. "He won't come back," he said. "You're safe." Lucia shook her head, still crying. "They will always come back. They never stop." David didn't argue. He just put a steady hand on her shoulder. And in that moment, Lucia understood something heartbreaking. Safety might only ever be a moment-to-moment battle for her. There might never be a day she wasn't holding her breath. Marisol gently knelt down too. "They see a statistic," she said, voice low. "I see a mother. Don't forget that." Lucia nodded, breathing deep, fighting to steady herself. She looked down at Mateo's tiny face, so fragile, so trusting, and felt the last of her walls crack. If she couldn't protect him, then what was left? But the worst was still coming. A truth that would change everything, even David. "Stay with me, because what happens next will break every lie wide open." The morning after the family court visit dawned gray and heavy. Lucia hadn't really slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the pounding at the door came back to her. The badge, the questions, the cold looks. It echoed every place she'd ever been told she didn't belong. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Mateo, and moved to the small kitchen where David was already making coffee. The smell was rich and comforting, but Lucia felt distant from it, like watching a movie of a life she couldn't have. He greeted her gently, but she could see he was worried too. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She almost laughed. "All right?" She was a mother the world seemed determined to erase, in a place that could change its mind any second. But she nodded. Because what else could she say? David poured her a cup, setting it carefully on the table. "There's something you should know," he began, his voice low, hesitant. "That social worker who came by, there's a reason he was so aggressive. He's tied to the same charity that funded the inspector's office." Lucia's breath caught. Corruption? Another twisted link in the chain of so-called safety? Of course it was. Of course the system that claimed to help children was the same one breaking their mothers. Her resentment burned so hot she could barely see straight. David reached for her hand. "I'm trying to fix it," he said. "I'm trying to use my resources. I didn't know it would get this complicated." Lucia drew her hand back, not unkindly, but with a quiet pain. "You think this is complicated," she whispered. "For you, maybe. For me, this is life." Her words landed hard. David looked away, ashamed. And maybe he should be. Maybe they all should be. Because the system that saw her as a case file, a burden, a statistic, it was still there, waiting to pounce. Even the good people couldn't see how heavy it was to be watched every single day, to be tested, to have to prove you were worthy of the simplest kindness. "I know," David murmured. "I know you've carried this longer than I can imagine." A knock broke the moment. Lucia's shoulders tensed, fear seizing her like a vice. But it was just Marisol. The advocate stepped in with a smile, holding an envelope. "It's good news," Marisol said. "We filed a temporary protection order. No one can remove Mateo while the investigation is ongoing." Lucia's legs almost gave out. Relief crashed through her so fierce it was painful. But even that relief was stained by resentment. Why should I have to fight for something so basic? Marisol touched her arm. "They won't get him," she repeated gently. "You have people now. Real ones." Lucia nodded, hugging Mateo close as he stirred awake. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe David, Marisol, all of them. But the scars from years of being judged weren't so easy to wash away. Even now, even here, a part of her was bracing for the next blow. A few hours later, David offered to drive her to a legal aid office downtown, where Marisol had set up an appointment. The city glimmered under a patchy sky, each puddle flashing brief sunlight as they passed. Lucia watched from the passenger seat, thinking how many nights she had walked those same streets alone, pushing Mateo's stroller, pretending she didn't see the stairs, pretending she couldn't hear the comments. Lazy. Illegal. Irresponsible. The cruelty of strangers had been so loud, for so long, she could barely remember what it was like to hope. Inside the legal office, the lawyer was kind, with a reassuring voice and folders of forms that might help. Lucia felt like she was being rebuilt one paper at a time, a birth certificate here, an affidavit there, threads of proof she had always been missing. Mateo napped in her lap while she signed her name over and over, each letter a tiny rebellion against the system that told her she didn't matter. David sat beside her, quiet, never rushing. His presence was a calm anchor in a sea of fear. Lucia wondered how many men in his world would have even noticed her, let alone stood by her. It made her throat tight, thinking that the kindness of one person could feel so impossible after a lifetime of being unseen. As they stepped back out into the afternoon, Lucia saw a bus rumble by, packed with workers in faded uniforms and faces lined with the same exhaustion she knew too well. She felt a stab of guilt, she was one of them. But she was also here, fighting, trying to build something better for Mateo. And she would never, ever apologize for that. Later, back at David's house, Marisol called with a new update. "A hearing is scheduled," she said. "In 2 weeks. I'll be there with you." Lucia swallowed hard. A hearing. The final test. The system would decide if she was good enough to keep her own child. The idea made her want to break something, to scream until the city heard her. But she stayed quiet, breathing in and out, gripping Mateo's small hand. She would not show fear. Not now. That night, she couldn't sleep. David found her in the hallway, pacing, holding Mateo against her chest. "What if they take him?" she blurted out, voice raw. "What if they think I'm not enough?" David shook his head, steady as ever. "They will see what I see," he promised. A mother who never gave up. Lucia looked at him, tears flooding her eyes. "Do you really see me?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I see you." Her heart cracked at that. The simple words felt bigger than any courtroom victory. Because it had been so long since anyone truly saw her, past the accent, past the worry, past the fear. She stood there, breathing in the warm air of David's house, letting his words wrap around her like armor. Maybe she could do this. Maybe, with help, she could survive. The days until the hearing blurred by. Lucia stayed close to Mateo, memorizing every coo, every laugh, every breath. She would not let a judge erase them. She refused. Finally, the hearing day arrived. Lucia wore a borrowed dress, hair pulled tight, eyes clear. David walked beside her, steady and strong. Marisol led them through the courthouse, promising she would not leave her side. In the sterile room, the judge looked Lucia over like a scientist studying a specimen. Lucia felt her stomach twist, that same old pain of being analyzed, measured, found wanting. She sat straight, Mateo in her arms, and refused to look away. They asked questions. Why she left her country. Why she had no documents. Why she deserved a chance. Each word felt like an attack, but Lucia answered with quiet honesty. She told them about her dreams, about her child, about wanting to work, to build, to stay alive. Her voice shook but did not break. At the end, the judge paused. The silence was terrible, stretching like a blade. Lucia prayed. Please. Finally, the judge spoke. I see no grounds for removal, she announced. The child will remain with his mother. Lucia nearly collapsed, tears streaming down her face. David caught her before she could fall, steadying her, whispering, "You did it." In that moment, every ounce of resentment, every wound, every scar, it all roared through her, not as defeat but as triumph. She had survived. She had stayed. She had won. Back at David's house, she held Mateo close, letting him sleep in her arms as the sun dipped behind the city skyline. The world outside might still judge them, still doubt them, but in this small safe space, they were enough. Marisol stopped by to hug her, smiling. You have a future now, she said softly. Lucia nodded, not trusting her voice. David asked, what will you do next? Lucia looked down at her baby, then back up with a spark in her eyes. I'll build a life, she said. I'll build a life they can't tear apart. He smiled, and together they watched the night settle. Mateo stirred, blinking at the world with calm trust. Lucia realized she would always carry the weight of how she'd been treated, how society had tried to crush her. But she would also carry this victory, a shining ember inside her heart. A reason to keep going. If you believe in second chances, if you believe no one should be left alone, share this story, and subscribe, because there are so many more voices that deserve to be heard.